Good morning. Thank you for joining me. I'm coming to you from Siloam Missionary Baptist Church. We're located at 4688 Mount Harmony Church Road in Rougemont, North Carolina, where the Reverend Wayne Johnson is pastor. I will be bringing you the Sunday School lesson for September 17, 2023, which is entitled The Fall of Jericho. Lesson text comes from Joshua chapter 6, verses 2 through 4, and verses 12 through 20a. Related scriptures comes from Genesis chapter 15, verses 16 through 21, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18, Joshua chapter 5, verse 13, and chapter 6, verse 1, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30. My name is Charlotte Timberlake. Scripture lesson text reads as thus: And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor. And ye shall compass the city, all ye men of war, and go round about the city once. Thus shalt thou do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow with the trumpets. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. And 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually, and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them. But the reward came after the ark of the Lord, the priests going on and blowing with the trumpets. And the 2nd day they compassed the city once, and returned into the camp. So they did 6 days. And it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. It came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. And the city shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And ye in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed, when ye take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Golden text. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the priests blew with the trumpets, Joshua said unto the people, Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city. Joshua chapter 6, verse 16. Today's lesson aim. Facts to show how God helped Joshua and his people overcome Jericho by trusting in him. Principle to show that God is a victorious God who works on the side of those who trust him. Application to teach that when we trust God, he will make us victorious. Introducing the lesson. The word defeat brings up sad thoughts of failure, which can be depressing. The opposite of that is victory, which brings to mind images of jubilation and joy. We face battles every day with the decisions that we have to make, the choices that have to be determined, and the steps that we have to take. The devil does everything he can to make sure we fail. Our lesson this week shows us how Joshua and his men simply followed God's instructions and were victorious. Developing the lesson. Number 1, promise of victory. Joshua chapter 6, verses 2 through 4. God is always victorious. Nothing can defeat him when he has set his plan in motion. God gave Joshua some simple, almost in our eyes, ridiculous instructions. Victory over Jericho would come through repeatedly walking around the walls of the city. Number 2, obedience in preparation for victory. Joshua chapter 6, verses 12 through 14. Here we see that Joshua obeyed God in the most minute details. Joshua rose early in the morning to do what God said. The ark of the Lord went before the people. It was a symbol of the presence of God. How many of us are brave enough to tell others that God is leading us in the battles we face? Joshua was not afraid to proclaim that truth. It takes courage to stand up for God. The priests marched ahead of the ark with armed soldiers preceding them and also following the ark. The priests sounded their horns, announcing the arrival of the beginning of victory. They all marched around the city this way once a day for 6 days. Number 3, the spectacular victory. Joshua chapter 6, verses 15 through 20a. When we are on God's side, we can be sure that we will win in the end. On the 7th day, the people marched around the city 7 times. In the Bible, 7 often refers to perfection or completion. As they concluded their march, the people, in obedience to Joshua, shouted. With the unbelievers in Jericho watching, the Israelites were shouting victory for the true God, Yahweh. Notice the 3 specific instructions that Joshua gave the people. First, they were to destroy the whole city and take nothing for themselves. Second, they were to keep a promise made to Rahab and her family by saving them. Third, all the gold, silver, bronze, and iron articles were to be sacred to the Lord and brought into the treasury. When the people did what God had told them about marching around the city, the walls came crashing down. I will now go over the questions in the back of the lesson. Question number 1. What were Joshua's orders from, and what did they assure him? The answer: the orders given to Joshua came directly from the heavenly headquarters and the Father himself. Before specific instructions were given, though, the Lord promised that Jericho had already been given to Joshua. Question number 2. What was the unusual military approach to Jericho that the Lord gave Joshua? The answer: God's plan was for the armed men and 7 priests with ram's horns to march around the city once each day for 6 days, and on the 7th day march around the city 7 times. Question number 3. What would this battle strategy ultimately teach Israel? The answer: God would give them the heavily fortified city of Jericho in such a miraculous way that there could be no doubt concerning his power and faithfulness. Question number 4. What was the order of march the Israelites were to establish? The answer: 7 of the priests blew ram's horn trumpets during the entire time of marching. They were in the middle of the marching line, followed by those carrying the ark. Leading the march was the main part of Joshua's army, and behind the priests came the rear guard. Question number 5. What was significant about the positioning of the priests and the ark in the march? The answer: God was making the entire approach to Jericho an exhibition of his presence with his people. Question number 6. What was different about the marching orders for Israel on the 7th day? The answer: God had told them to march around the city 7 times, and that was exactly what they did. Question number 7. What would signal the time to shout? The answer: Joshua told the people that when they heard the blast of the horn, they were to shout because God had already given them the city. It was to be a shout of victory. Question number 8. What did God say Israel was to do with the things and people of Jericho? The answer: every material item in the city, with one explicit exception, was under God's ban and doomed for destruction. Question number 9. What would happen if God's orders were disobeyed? The answer: Joshua warned that if anyone took anything that was accursed, that person too would become accursed. And question number 10. How does the text describe the final outcome of Israel's actions? The answer: the blast sounded, and an earth-shattering yell arose from the marching crowd, which now stood in place, ready to charge into the city. The huge wall of Jericho began to crumble to the ground and was soon lying flat. Here are the practical points. Number 1, you can consider God's promises as good as done. Joshua chapter 6, verse 2, cross-reference Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. Number 2, many of God's promises are conditioned on our obedience. Joshua chapter 6, verses 3 through 4. Number 3, the best evidence of trust in the Lord is obedience to the Lord. Verses 12 through 13. Number 4, never grow weary in obeying the Lord, even in mundane things. Joshua chapter 6, verse 14, cross-reference Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Number 5, believe in God's promises and encourage others to do the same. Joshua chapter 6, verses 15 through 16. Number 6, keep your promises, our judge is watching. Verses 17 through 19. And number 7, God's work done God's way will always be victorious. Verse 20. Summary. When we are on God's side, victory is always the outcome. We simply need to claim his promises and act in faith. We have a God who loves us so much that he wants us to have the victory every time. But when we disobey and stray from what he tells us to do, the journey in the wilderness gets longer and longer until we realize that we need to get back to God and obey him. The sooner we learn to obey his instructions, the sooner we will find ourselves on the victorious side. God will always keep instructing his children and waiting for their obedience. Victory comes from the Lord our God. We dare not forget that every victory in our lives comes from his loving hands as a result of his love for us. Always choose to obey him. This will conclude the lesson for this morning. Thank you for listening. Obedience is the key that unlocks God's promises.